done? What came over me? Who am I? It was wonderful. I loved every minute of it.
At 78, Sally Field is no longer holding her tongue. After decades of applause, awards, and public adoration, she's finally naming names, and not the ones you'd expect. Behind those iconic roles and warm smiles lies a history few ever saw. One filled with silence, sabotage, and stifled emotion. These weren't petty squabbles or momentary tensions. They were the kind of encounters that change how you walk onto a set, or whether you ever walk back. What happens when brilliance turns cold, or charm conceals control? One name on this list turned a rom-com into something far darker. But which one? Tommy Lee Jones. When Sally Field signed on to star in Backroads, she was hopeful. The script had grit and emotional complexity. Everything she loved about character-driven storytelling. She came to set prepared to dive deep, to build something real with her co-star, Tommy Lee Jones. But instead of artistic partnership, she ran into a wall. From day one, Jones made it clear he had no interest in connection, no room for warmth, and certainly no intention of meeting her halfway. Sally described his presence on set as cold and distant. He didn't engage in conversation, skipped the usual bonding rituals between actors, and refused to participate in rehearsals with any sense of curiosity or openness. He would show up, hit his marks, deliver his lines, and then disappear, physically and emotionally. For an actress like Sally, who thrives on collaboration and emotional reciprocity, the experience was more than disappointing. It was alienating. She tried to bridge the gap. Between takes, she'd make conversation, ask questions about their characters, or even try to crack light-hearted jokes. But Tommy Lee Jones wouldn't bite. He barely acknowledged her, never offering more than a grunt or a sideways glance. It was like acting opposite a wall, she later admitted. Not only was she performing alone on screen, she was emotionally alone off-screen too. The emotional chill bled into their performances. Critics later noted the lack of chemistry between the two leads, but few understood the source of that disconnect. It wasn't a problem with the writing. It was the emotional vacuum between takes. Sally later reflected that it felt like she was carrying the entire emotional weight of the film by herself, trying to coax vulnerability out of scenes that had none to give. What was worse was the sense that the whole thing was so needless. Sally never expected Jones to show real kindness to her, but she thought he would treat her with at least some modicum of respect. Instead, he made her feel unwelcome, almost like she were an intruder on the set, someone to be tolerated rather than appreciated. That would hurt for a woman who had established herself as a fine actress. Sally never publicly complained, but she didn't need to. In interviews, whenever questioned about her days working with Jones, she would offer courteous responses, but there was a note of chill in her voice. It was clear she felt bad about the whole experience. Set the record straight. She was drained by the whole experience, but not because of the subject matter, but because of the dearth of emotional content in it. She tentatively maneuvered through the layers of link and connection that acted as either the glue or the path to sabotage. Acting was not lines for Sally. It was feeling. It was connection. And above all, it was truth. Without that spark of human energy from her co-star, she felt adrift. Yes, the production had wrapped, but that isolation strayed on long after it. It was a reminder that not every scene of uncomfortable working conditions consisted of loud voices or drama. Sometimes silence did the most damage. Going on from Backroads, Sally never hired Tommy Lee Jones again. The very emotional toll on itself from that set would leave her not requiring another reason to be wary of any actor who confused stoicism with strength. She came into the movie all geared up to give herself to it. She walked out, knowing that sometimes the most challenging part of the job is not the performance, but standing next to someone who refuses to see you. Adding yet another layer to the emotional disconnection, it has been reported that crew members on back roads perceived a world of difference separating the work methods of the two leads. One assistant director would later comment in an interview, "Sally came in every day ready to collaborate. Tommy kept to himself so completely, it was like working with two separate productions." This gulf affected not only Sally, but the entire set. With the rapport usually needed between the leads to establish rhythm and cohesion missing, scenes seemed more disconnected and emotionally flat than they might have been. Even Martin Ritt, the director who had gotten on well with Field on Norma Ray, was said to have had problems handling a lack of chemistry on the set. It wasn't a difference in temperament. It was a difference of one actor coming to connect, the other coming to work in a vacuum. Sally's reflections take on more ballast from that larger viewpoint. The absence of an emotional partnership didn't just alienate her, it detracted from the very fabric of the film. But emotional distance wasn't the only kind of damage Sally would face in her career. The next one came with a smile and a spotlight. Bert Reynolds. When the world looked at Sally Field and Bert Reynolds in the late 1970s, it saw magic. Their on-screen chemistry in Smokey and the Bandit was electric, flirtatious, fun, and utterly captivating. Off-screen, they became a golden couple of the era, the subject of headlines and admiration. But beneath the glossy surface, their relationship was a very different story. One defined not by love and laughter, but by subtle control and emotional erosion. Sally Field would later describe Bert Reynolds as a man who thrived on dominance. While the cameras captured charm, what happened behind closed doors was far more unsettling. Reynolds reportedly belittled her regularly, often mocking her looks or questioning her intelligence in ways that appeared harmless to outsiders, but left deep marks on her self-worth. His behavior wasn't always loud or overt. Sometimes it was the backhanded compliments during interviews or the cold silences at home that chipped away at her confidence. In her memoir, In Pieces, Sally laid bare how deeply the imbalance of power ran in their relationship. She wrote of how Bert routinely interrupted her, overrode her decisions, and silenced her voice, both personally and professionally. He didn't want a partner. He wanted someone to smile beside him and say nothing. "I never felt truly seen," she admitted, underscoring just how invisible she felt, even at the peak of her fame, when standing next to a man the public idolized. Perhaps the most painful part, as Sally described, was the emotional manipulation. Bert would alternate between being charming and affectionate one moment and cold or withholding the next. This emotional whiplash left her disoriented and unsure of herself. She was constantly trying to regain his affection, only to be met with more distance or passive-aggressive remarks. Over time, the imbalance made her feel small, like a possession to be displayed, not a person to be loved. Sally fought through the pain. She wanted the relationship to work out. She loved him, or at least, the version of him she wished was real. She sacrificed her own emotional health to keep them together. But the Bandit, the man the world celebrated, was not the man she went home to. "I was there, but not me, not the full me," is all Sally offered as a heartbreaking acknowledgement of how much of herself she lost trying to fulfill his expectations. While Reynolds spoke of regret, beauty, and nostalgia in public, fondly mentioning Sally in interviews years after their separation, for her, the memories were much more complex, giving rise to grief for the one she had to become to get through that phase of her life. Where everyone else saw a fairy tale, that Sally had realized that the struggle to love one who wanted control rather than connection was hers alone. It took Sally years to decipher fully what had occurred between them. Time and distance enabled her to recognize the toxic patterns that she had previously interpreted as passion or complexity. In reality, she had given everything that she had for someone who never made room for her to be her entire self. The damage was long-standing, the betrayal deeper than the public ever realized. In the end, Bert Reynolds became one of those defining chapters in the personal history of Sally Field. Not because of the love shared between them, but because of the very heartbreak he caused. He may have helped to carve out her fame, but he also sought to carve out her identity. And while she may walk away bruised from that relationship, she also walks away wiser, and again determined never to lose herself in the shadow of someone else's spotlight. The situation became tangled for their romance, with Sally Field stating that she had hesitated to speak publicly about the darker side of their relationship since she was concerned that she might actually be blamed or not believed. "It would have hurt too much to admit he had harmed me, and I didn't want to tarnish the memory of who people thought he was," she confessed in a 2018 interview with the New York Times for the release of her memoir, In Pieces. With this declaration, we understand how emotional manipulation keeps even the most empowered women like Sally Field silent, especially when their abuser is a man adored by the public. It goes further to show how fame can also serve as armor for their toxic acts. This was not just an imbalanced situation between Sally and Bert. It was between a private reality and a public myth. For so many years, she honored the latter while bearing the scars inflicted by a man who hid his control behind a charming veneer. She protected his image while quietly diminishing her own truth. Only with time, distance, and hard-earned clarity did she reclaim her voice. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't out of revenge. It was out of release. James Woods. James Woods brought a kind of sharp, brooding energy to the set that didn't just complicate the creative atmosphere, it poisoned it. Known for his intense intellect and strong opinions, Woods approached the work like a chessboard. Every line, every scene, became a battleground for control. He didn't just challenge direction or question his own material. He actively picked apart Sally Field's performance mid-rehearsal. For an actress as emotionally open and collaborative as Sally, his relentless corrections and unsolicited critiques weren't constructive. They were soul-crushing. Woods's intellect wasn't used to collaborate. It was used to dominate. Sally described him as someone who wielded big words and complicated phrasing like weapons, less to engage and more to intimidate. Every interaction felt like a test. Instead of partnering to create chemistry, he built emotional walls she couldn't break through. Rather than listen or respond with empathy, he dissected and dismissed. Off-camera, it didn't improve. Woods would suggest, sometimes with a shrug, that Sally wasn't giving enough, that her heart wasn't in the performance. For someone who had poured everything into her roles for decades, those comments weren't merely insulting, they were destabilizing. They made her question her instincts and her value, and that, she later realized, was the goal. This wasn't really some creative tension, this was psychological warfare. Woods wasn't asking her to explore her work more deeply. Instead, he was methodically eating away at her confidence, stripping her of any creative ground, and occupying the emotional space that was supposed to be shared. Sally had gotten through sets tougher than this one, but it wasn't about loud tempers or egos clashing. This was lethal, calculated, and silent. Rather than character work, it exhausted her to constantly defend her artistic legitimacy. Each day became an internal battle, to feel like she had her integrity intact, in an atmosphere designed to make her feel small. She was sword and shield that day. It was a personal pledge. She will never again allow anyone's intelligence or conceit to belittle her talent. It took too long to build her career in an industry that was male-dominated for someone merely to dismantle it by condescension that masquerades as insight. James Woods may have been conceited enough to think himself the most brilliant man in the room, but he became something more corrosive to her, a collaborator whose aim was not to lift, but rather to diminish. And yet, she emerged from the experience stronger and more assured. Additionally, she now bore with her the quiet knowledge that even sabotage could come in a friendly guise and with a sharp vocabulary. Sally's experience resonated with others' secret sharing of their experiences. Woods's colleagues described a journey through similar behavior, incessantly aggressive and toxic. Sharon Stone once referred to him as brilliant but exhausting, with a work style oriented much more toward confrontation than cooperation. That pattern of aggression has not been an isolated incident, but rather a recurrent theme in Woods's career. For Sally, the experience became an individual reckoning, but also an industry wake-up call that no amount of good writing, directing, or intention can produce real chemistry when one actor treats acting as a power play. Copious in the concern surrounding Woods's professional behavior were references made by director Oliver Stone, who worked with him on Salvador in 1986. Interviews have seen Stone acknowledge Woods as incredibly talented but incredibly difficult, the shoot itself being likened to a balancing act between brilliance and volatility. Woods would bring penetrating intensity to a scene, then turn destructive and wreck it, thanks to his combative nature and total unwillingness to compromise. These very same comments strengthen the case for the pattern found by Sally Field, one in which Woods's striving for dominance came very often at the price of collaboration. Even John Carpenter, who directed Woods in Vampires 1998, called him a force of nature who could be challenging to rein in. Just when Sally thought the cold had passed, a different kind of heat took over the set. Shirley, MacLaine. To the public, Steel Magnolias was a masterclass in ensemble acting. 6 powerhouse actresses portraying friendship, loss, and resilience with grace and depth. Among them, Sally Field and Shirley MacLaine stood out as seasoned legends sharing the screen. But behind the scenes, their dynamic was far from harmonious. What audiences saw as touching and heartfelt masked a far more strained and competitive relationship. From the moment cameras rolled, there was a subtle but constant tension. Sally approached the film with deep emotional investment, especially in her role as Malin, a grieving mother trying to stay strong. She brought vulnerability, authenticity, and quiet strength to her performance. But Shirley MacLaine approached the film like a battlefield. Colleagues whispered that she treated each scene as a power play, asserting her presence even when it wasn't her moment to shine. According to Sally, Shirley frequently injected herself into scenes that weren't hers, stealing focus with off-script remarks or exaggerated reactions. Rather than support the emotional beats Sally was working so hard to deliver, Shirley often derailed them with sarcasm or bravado. The contrast in their approaches was stark. Where Sally sought emotional truth, Shirley seemed to crave control of the spotlight. One scene in particular haunted Sally long after filming ended. It was an intensely emotional moment, one where she had to dig deep to portray Malin's raw grief. It should have been straightforward, but it took 17 takes. Not because Sally couldn't deliver, but because Shirley kept undercutting the gravity of the moment with quips and interruptions. To Sally, it felt like deliberate sabotage, a refusal to allow her the emotional space she needed. But Sally was a consummate professional. She nailed every mark, gave her all, and would not let the pressure boil over on the set. But inwardly, she was drained. Rather than find solace with another actress, Sally constantly found herself defending the emotional integrity of her performance. Cameras would capture tears and tenderness. What was real, however, was much colder and far more draining. Years later, Sally never spoke poorly of Shirley in public. In interviews, she referred to the disagreement with a calm clarity. "She brought a cloud of chaos wherever she went," Sally once said. "Words are not bitter, just honest." This was not simply a clash of personalities, but a fundamental difference regarding values. While Shirley wanted to dominate, Sally wanted only to serve the story. The tension had left an indelible impression, even with Steel Magnolias attaining the status of a classic. To this day, Sally is unable to detach the film from the off-screen tensions that shaped it. While the audience sobbed through Malin's emotional monologue, Sally knew the real battle wasn't in front of the camera. It was in fighting, somehow, for the space to perform. Yet this sealed in a painful but vital truth for Sally Field. Sometimes there is no guarantee of mutual respect, even amongst icons. And while she may never have let that rivalry compromise her work, she never forgot how terribly draining it was to fight for space in creativity when she only wanted to share that with someone. Certainly, the presence of Shirley MacLaine rendered Steel Magnolias memorable, but Sally made it especially memorable for all the wrong reasons. Shirley MacLaine's behavior seemed to create more than just interpersonal strain between two people, as other cast members echoed Sally Field's experience. Julia Roberts and Dolly Parton, from various interviews, described the Steel Magnolias set as intense and at times clashing, with Dolly even joking in retrospect that the estrogen was flying, not that someone publicly named names. The hush-hush mutual understanding underlines all that Sally had lived through. The emotional torture wasn't imagined or isolated. In her memoir, My Lucky Stars, MacLaine herself confessed being opinionated and territorial during ensemble shoots, particularly if she thought her character might be overshadowed. This frank self-assessment adds another layer to the validity of Sally's claim that the tension was not a one-time feud, but more a symptom of Shirley's need to dominate scenes. For Sally, who valued emotional honesty to play against one-upmanship, the mismatch is thus not only exhausting, it is a violation of the unspoken trust between performers. Dustin Hoffman. Dustin Hoffman's name is synonymous with acting greatness. With multiple Oscars and critically revered performances, he built a legacy as one of Hollywood's finest. But for Sally Field, his name evokes something very different. Though they never co-starred in a major film, their brief encounter during a chemistry read in the early 1980s left her shaken, humiliated, and permanently disillusioned. The project, a now-forgotten film that never made it past development, was supposed to be an exciting opportunity. For Sally, it was another chance to prove herself alongside a giant of the industry. But the moment she walked into the room, she realized something was wrong. Hoffman had already taken control of the space, joking with producers, making pointed remarks about the script, and creating an atmosphere that felt less like a creative meeting and more like a power play. When it came time to read, Hoffman's behavior shifted from confident to cutting. He interrupted her multiple times mid-delivery, not to explore the scene or offer feedback, but to correct her interpretation in front of everyone. His comments weren't collaborative. They were condescending, questioning her instincts and undermining her choices. Sally, a seasoned actress with 2 Emmys under her belt by that point, suddenly felt like a schoolgirl auditioning for approval. She later described the experience as one of the most demeaning moments of her career. The way Hoffman wielded control in the room wasn't just unkind, it was strategic. He dominated the space, created an imbalance and made sure the spotlight stayed on him. Sally wasn't just critiqued, she was systematically dismantled in front of the very people she was trying to impress. Days went by, and the sting turned worse when she heard from a contact common to them that Hoffman dared to brag about having sabotaged the audition. According to the story, he told someone that the chemistry wasn't there and that he had made sure of it. For Sally, it was not just wicked, it was treachery. The experience made her feel not only sore, but cast her in doubt about her talent and whether she had indeed failed when, in reality, there was never a chance given. For weeks, she replayed the encounter over and over in her mind, trying to understand how everything went wrong. But time brought clarity. She finally understood that her performance was not the problem. It was his ego. Hoffman treated the audition not as a moment of collaboration, but as a competition he intended to win, even if that meant trampling some other person's opportunity in the process. The incident marked a milestone in Sally's attitude to the profession, how she would promise never again to allow a man to perturb her self-worth. Pain had been associated with the struggle she shed so much blood for her freedom to entertain space for her control. She no longer accepted humiliation as part of the artistic process. Dustin Hoffman may remain in the public imagination as a cinematic giant, but for Sally Field, he served as a very keen lesson on how even legends can fall short of living up to the art they profess to serve. Behind the bright strung lights fell a man who, in a single afternoon, reminded her that cruelty doesn't always wear its voice upraised. Sometimes it appears all dressed up in brilliance. As if further weight were needed for Sally Field's account, Dustin Hoffman has had a messy, disturbing history with a number of women co-stars, which makes this instance nearly credible in itself. In 2017, he was accused of inappropriate behavior by several women, including Anna Graham Hunter, a death of a salesman intern. Hunter stated, "He was a pig, but I was told to suck it up." It casts retrospective light on Hoffman's off-camera persona. What happened to Sally during that chemistry read wasn't just a divergence from the norm. It was part of a much larger, longer pattern across categories of disrespect toward women in professional settings. So, in Sally's case, the humiliation becomes all the more poignant, not as a direct offense, but as yet another instance of an acclaimed actor wielding his authority to control and devalue those around him under the guise of creative rigor. What happened with Hoffman was cruel, but the next experience would test her sanity. Robert Blake. Sally Field had high hopes when she signed on to film Say Goodbye, Maggie Cole. The project was ambitious, a made-for-TV movie with emotional weight and dramatic potential. But the moment filming began, those hopes were swiftly derailed by one man, Robert Blake. Known for his intensity and method acting, Blake brought not passion, but chaos. Sally quickly found herself in the eye of a storm that would never let up. From the beginning, Blake's behavior made it nearly impossible for Sally to find any rhythm. He would change lines mid-scene without warning, toss out scripted dialogue, and insert erratic behavior that caught everyone, including the camera, off guard. What he likely saw as artistic spontaneity, Sally experienced as pure disruption. It wasn't just difficult to work with him, it was nearly impossible to act opposite him in any consistent or meaningful way. His volatility wasn't limited to the performance. Crew members reported frequent mood swings, verbal outbursts, and a working environment riddled with tension. One day, Blake might be quiet and focused. The next, he'd be shouting at a lighting technician or walking off set in the middle of a minor disagreement. Sally, who was already managing the pressures of a demanding role, found herself stepping in to calm situations and smooth over his unpredictability. tasks that fell far outside her job as an actress. The chaos bled into every corner of the production. Scenes had to be reshot, schedules constantly rearranged, and morale on set plummeted. Despite Sally's professionalism and efforts to stay centered, the dysfunction became inescapable. Instead of focusing on her performance, she was playing peacekeeper, simply trying to keep the shoot afloat amid the instability. It wasn't sustainable, and eventually, it showed. Shadowing the whole affair was some very heavy tension, which cut off all hope of an amicable production. Say Goodbye, Maggie Cole could not air since it was shelved before production. Such was the toxic nature of the environment, by which nothing could ever be brought forth in time for television. With most actors, that might have been nothing more than a professional disappointment. But for Sally, it was even more profound. She went into the project committed and hopeful, only to come out emotionally drained and disillusioned. This loss wasn't just a film, it was her trust in the process. Sally would later characterize it as a traumatic, never a mere frustration. She was what she termed the box of animals. An actor is an actor, and there are the others who need to belittle all the others to feel big. An actor who'd gotten some wrong was Blake. Not only was he disruptive to the work, but he also poisoned it, slaying any opportunity for real collaboration or growth. She learned a lesson from it, her hard line to be crossed ever again, that she would not allow emotional abuse disguised by so-called creative genius to be tolerated again. She understood that unpredictability does not make a performance more real. In fact, it makes the workplace unbearable. It would never be worth it. Turning her back on Say Goodbye, Maggie Cole, though, Sally was secretly swearing off such promises. She would never let anyone do this again, no matter how talented or celebrated, hijack her work or silence her process. Robert Blake may have derailed that film, but he also sharpened her resolve. From that day forward, Sally Field would not just protect the integrity of her characters, she would protect herself. Incorporating a wider industry contextuality, Say Goodbye, Maggie Cole became one of those cautionary tales about the dangers that unchecked behavior in high-pressure environments brings to Hollywood parlance. While Blake's volatility may have been tolerated as part of some so-called tortured genius archetype in decades past, productions like this one have provided painful revelation into what such conduct costs. According to a former ABC executive, the network pulled the plug for two reasons: production delays that intensified reports of dysfunction threatening the well-being of cast and crew. That experience of Sally bore witness to a larger industry trend, one in which emotional abuse, regardless of its artistic wrapper, was beginning to lose ground. Her experience helped signal an increasing demand for accountability, especially among veteran actors long shielded by reputation. She's marked in many ways by her quiet refusal to excuse chaos as genius. Survivor, not only at that site, but an early voice for safer, more respectful creative spaces. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as revealing as we did, give it a thumbs up, drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold Hollywood moments. Want to know what really happened behind another famous feud? Tap the next video on your screen. You won't want to miss it.